Start AI companion. Hmm, why not? Okay, so you can see the presentation, right? Dementia starts early in life. And if there's anything wrong with the slides, please let me know. Basically, took me a while to wrap my brain around this one. It's certainly not a no-brainer, double negation. But, since I'm balanced on omega-3, plus 20% DHA, I can actually make those statements. There's so much to the brain, it's impossible to package it into one talk, but obviously, we're all afraid of dementia. It's basically a very, very terrible disease, something you want to avoid at all costs. I think it's probably the worst disease. And not being able to actually understand what's happening with your own life, your own body, not being able to literally compute input output is probably the worst thing. I mean, we go through a lot of diseases, but um, pain is a good signal. We can understand it and then we can do something about it. But when the system is broken to analyze, then it's probably the worst thing. It's like being in a bad simulation. So, unfortunately, more and more evidence is showing that dementia is starting much earlier in life, and it is definitely a disease that builds up over many, many years and decades. And there's plenty of evidence on that. And there's plenty of evidence on how omega-3 plays a big role in that. So, just a reminder, there's no difference really between cardiovascular disease and dementia. They go hand in hand, and this is the reason why we're doing it. Your 100% chance of heart disease at 3.5%. That is definitely not a good test that we have normally 2.5% and less. So this is definitely the number one killer. And you can kind of understand how when your cardiovascular system, in Chinese medicine, we talk a lot about blood deficiency. So the quality of the blood and the quality of the arteries doesn't nourish the brain. This goes hand in hand, and only when you get up to 7.5 and 8%, what all the research shows, this risk goes to close to zero. So the brain is special, and the brain has definitely had a evolutionary priority. Um, it absorbs omega-3 at a completely different mechanism because it has absolute priority. And today I'm going to talk about two proteins in the brain that basically facilitate that and that play a major role in these diseases of dementia. One of them is MFSD2A, long word, major facility superfamily domain containing protein 2A. Okay, that's why we have abbreviations. And that is the transporter of the omega-3 in your brain. And it will always ensure a minimal function of DHA. Again, the brain is prioritizing it, and it's not working on your normal absorption mechanism that I explained the last two times over the lymph system. And then we have the BDNF, the brain-derived neurotropic factor. that plays a role in inflammation control and many other things. And so basically, those are also mentioned in my book. You can read about that there or on my website, omega3health.us. So here's a list of all the brain diseases, dementia in quotation. There's many of them, and you can kind of categorize them into neurodevelopmental disorders. Um, that would be learning disabilities and basic the disabilities that we attribute to the young population now, but even older population can get ADHD and autism. Those are spectrum diseases. They're very hard to diagnose, and there's very little science behind them. And then obviously we have the heavy-duty psychiatric diseases, depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, you name it. And there's some science behind those. And then we have our inflammatory or autoimmune diseases. And those are basically multiple sclerosis, general inflammatory diseases like lupus. And they go into the brain, and you can actually see the damage in the nerve cells and in the conduction and the whole brain function. This goes hand in hand with vascular damage, which is a result of metabolic syndrome. So diabetic encephalopathy, long word. So when you are shooting insulin for a long time, you're in a chronic state of inflammation. You're also damaging the vascular supply in your brain. And again, this goes hand in hand with general CVD. And obviously, that's the reason for a stroke. And then uncategorized epilepsy, migraines, etc., which are all kind of more like syndromes. So today we'll talk about neurodegenerative disorders, where you supposedly actually see the degeneration in the brain, which you can diagnose in Alzheimer's, but you cannot in Parkinson's. There really isn't any diagnosis in Parkinson's. It's a whole topic on its own, and how it's treated is not useful. ALS also falls under that, but in general, dementia is literally just memory loss, forgetfulness. Your brain just cannot compute its environment anymore. And that is a devastating disease that comes second or third after heart disease and cancer. So this all begins very early in life, and this is no longer a hypothesis, and it stands on increasing and robust evidence. There's compelling research showing how omega-3 is basically required to have a protective effect on the brain throughout life. And that is what is the root of the development of this disease. And it is required in reducing your incidence of dementia. So when you have enough DHA, you have the cornerstone of building blocks in your neuronal membranes. And I will talk about how neurons are actually very interestingly made for life. So, believe it or not, when we are born, they're made for life. However, that doesn't mean that you can't change their functionality. And there's, as I also already mentioned, a special protein with that long name, MFSD2A. And that goes hand in hand with the blood-brain barrier and its selectivity, because you don't want to put everything into the brain cells that normally circulates in the body. Yeah, the DHA comes from the mother, and we know that that data is measurable in our tests. So we measure the mother and then the baby, and we can see how the baby is desperately trying to incorporate omega-3. Where else can it come from? Because the baby grows for 9 months in the mother's womb and then breastfeeding, of course. So that is also very important because the absorption ability of a young infant on omega-3 is very low. So it has to come through the breast milk. And this has a heavy influence on the IQ status early and late in life. It's a whole nother topic on its own, but basically goes hand in hand with dementia. So, studies show that poor maternal nutrition, low birth weight, um, causes inaccurate neurodevelopment, and that in turn alters your brain structure and how these neurons communicate with each other. And we know very little actually about how the brain works. We just know that connections are established, and that requires synaptic firing, and none of that works without omega-3. So basically, all of that starts very early already in the womb. And by the age of 20, you have basically a very established brain architecture already. Many of the connections are already made. And if you are deficient, you can see the reduced gray matter. So by the way, I just published my book on alpha acupuncture. That's what acupuncture does. It changes the gray to white matter. There are actual pain centers in your brain, memories of pain. And so, again, all of that goes hand in hand with a poor cardiovascular system, hand in hand with poor lifestyle and poor food choices. And they all correlate with a dementia risk later on. Yeah, so there's a new word out. I just saw this publication, chronification of inflammation. I love it. So it's not chronic inflammation, it's chronification. So what does that imply? That you are actually playing a part in that. So inflammation doesn't just come on its own. And metabolic disease, as you can see here, is one of the root causes for dementia. So these studies, they look at a lot of factors and, how your childhood, emotional environment, social environment, and, parents are alcoholics, you name it. All of that stuff basically plays into dementia later on. Um, yeah, we kind of call that epigenetics too. So genes are turned on and off depending on your lifestyle and your environment. But the chronification of inflammation, so nicely said here, is basically one of the most important root causes of a later event of dementia. So how does that work? Just a little preview here. We have a situation where you are basically shifting inflammatory to non-inflammatory immune cells in the brain. And there's the same situation that I always talk about with your general immunity. I have 4-hour talks on the autoimmunity now. So basically, there is a shift of the microglial cells. They are the um, immune cells in the brain from inflammatory to pro-inflammatory to anti-inflammatory. Kind of the same as in the rest of the body. So basically, TNF alpha and IL-6 are the main culprits here, cytokines that cause inflammation. And then you have a situation where that needs to be turned off. So these cells can be basically interchangeably switched on and off and produce anti-inflammatory cytokines, TGF beta, IL-10, but also the BDNF that I will talk about. So all of those microglial inflammatory cells cause chronification and then a cognitive decline despite of the brain's priority in DHA. That just isn't enough. So we've seen that in our tests where basically the mother previously had a high amount of omega-3 is now 65% deficient in EPA, and the baby is 82% deficient because it desperately wants to balance its DHA, which has priority in the brain. This in turn turns the mother down to 40% deficiency in DHA, whereas before she was balanced. So this proves that the baby desperately trying to develop its nervous system is sucking out the last DHA molecule from the mother. And we need to pay close attention to this. However, I don't have a single midwife or OBGYN that pays any attention to this. It is an uphill battle against the narrative, and there are some prenatal omega-3 supplements which I recently tested completely inadequate and rancid. So yeah, I mean, the whole problem starts with poor focus, memory loss, low mental clarity. We call that brain fog. Basically sluggish behavior of the brain. And that is a result of your DHA omega-3 deficiency, not only causing massive inflammatory response through omega-6 prevalence, but there's a whole lot of functional problems that come with the loss of DHA, then leading to mitochondrial dysfunction. That's your aerobic function. The brain needs aerobic function. It needs massive amounts of aerobic energy. When you are doing keto or a starvation state, the brain needs sugar. So that's why we have gluconeogenesis in the liver. We're making sugar. That's, by the way, what metformin works on, and to some degree, GLP-1. So these are basically very, very important ingredients to keep your brain functional and in an aerobic state. So your mitochondria need to work. Um, you can't do anaerobic energy production in the brain, and it's not even comparable to ATP versus 32 in your mitochondria. So we know that I've talked about this many times, how omega-3 basically is necessary in the transport electron chain and the ATPase. So yeah, that is also then, of course, affecting all of the neurotransmitters and creating this state of brain fog. So kind of a mini summary here, the decline of certain proteins I will talk about now is causing this problem. Um, your blood-brain barrier is now more permeable without omega-3 because of the connections. It's the same thing as in leaky gut, no difference, the same proteins involved. And I will show you how that works. There's another gene that's of interest here, which I'm not talking about today, but how molecules, including glucose, get transported into the brain is extremely important. And obviously doesn't take a genius to understand that this is the root cause of early dementia or late dementia. So that is omega-6, and we know from our tests how omega-6 is 25 to 1 average in excess of omega-3. And the evidence that high omega-6 actually inhibits the absorption of DHA into the brain neurons, basically making a dysfunctional blood-brain barrier, is now mounting up. So never mind that the brain actually has a priority of DHA and it's trying to suck out the lost DHA from your body. At 90% deficiency, that is very hard to do. And at a very high omega-6 ratio, this process is inhibited. So excessive omega-6 actually blocks that important step of DHA uptake. And that is also important in a synaptic function, which I will get to. So when you just divide populations into their omega-3 content, and I really don't know how they even get this 6.1% quintile. These are the best studies, right? Because you don't have to deal with placebos. You don't have to deal with low quality supplementation or toxic fish or anything. Just look at what is the percentage of DHA in the population. And we know that 6.1% is very, very, very rare. Almost nobody has that in our tests. And we know that that isn't even enough, as I've shown you in the very beginning. It needs to be minimum 8%. That's when it really gets interesting. And there's an exponential increase in cardiovascular disease that starts at 7.5% or below 7.5%. So very interesting here, the data, very similar to the heart disease. And you can put this probably into a logarithmic curve. Interestingly, there's many other factors involved. So it doesn't go to zero, but we don't have any 8%, we don't have any 10% data, and then we don't have that data over 30 years, right? And that's probably the reason why this doesn't go to zero, but the effect is very, very prominent. It's half at 6%. And when you measure omega-3, you can actually see the brain shrinking. So a 3.2% higher omega-3 index. That's a lot. We know it takes a while to get that. Creates a very measurable increase in brain size or hippocampal size. And you can prevent 2 years of brain aging with 3.2%. So, once the brain is damaged to a certain degree and dementia has set on for, I would say, more than 3 years, it is very, very difficult to reverse it. But we never give up. So that is why you want to prevent this early on. And the interesting molecule that I mentioned earlier is BDNF, the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, also in my book, basically plays a crucial role in the brain. So we always measure omega-3 in the RBCs, red blood cells, and here, this article actually showed us that BDNF is actually a better marker than omega-3 measured in RBCs. So you can measure this in blood tests. So RBC basically reflects the the intake of triglyceride bound DHA. That doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. No, you need to make a whole nother form of DHA called LPC DHA, which I will go through a little bit later. That is basically a very, very important lipid-bound DHA molecule. And you can see here that when BDNF increases with omega-3, you can basically incorporate much, much better omega-3. And you can see that with the increase in omega-3 in the RBCs, you can definitely push the system. So black here is very high omega-3 in your red blood cells, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you actually have LPC bound DHA that can actually then be incorporated into the brain. So there's kind of like an inverse relationship between the two here. There are other factors involved in how you make that LPC DHA. And just increasing omega-3 may not necessarily actually end up in the brain. That's basically what this article shows. But we know that if you are at a very high level of omega-3 for a long time, you literally kick out your omega-6, and then this process should be easily repaired. So is brain fog reversible? Probably for most people in early stages. And it has a lot to do with your actual gut repair. I talked about that the last two talks. Most people don't even properly absorb omega-3. Omega-3 is required to absorb itself. So leaky gut and leaky blood-brain barrier go together. All of that needs to be complemented with high antioxidants. The brain really requires that. You really want to keep reactive oxygen species out of your brain. You need to support your mitochondria. And that's kind of like what I call an anti-inflammatory diet. And I showed you earlier that dementia has a lot of factors involved in its development. And so we know that cortisol levels go down with less stress and more sleep. So yeah, all of that is pretty easy to understand. DHA maintains the blood-brain barrier integrity. So not only is it essential for this transporter protein, MSFT2A, that brings in that LPC DHA, lyso-PC, that's a lipid DHA bond. Um, it is very crucial for it. But we can show in animal experiments. The experiments are hard to do in humans. How actually, when you get rid of that protein, you cause a severely leaking blood-brain barrier. So what does it tell you? It's not a direct effect. So the MSFDA and MFSD2A is a transporter protein. It's not directly involved in the blood-brain barrier connections, but it is absolutely essential, meaning that omega-3 is essentially deficient, so then your blood-brain barrier becomes leaky. And that also will then activate your M1 microglial cells towards inflammation, creating a vicious cycle. So the actual proteins involved in the blood-brain barrier or the tight junctions, same as in your gut cells, are occludin, claudins, and the CO1, which DHA was shown to stabilize. I have a nice picture on that coming up here soon. So the deficiency really leads to degradation of these proteins and increases the blood-brain barrier permeability, especially creating inflammatory cytokines and reactive oxygen species. And DHA is special. It's different than EPA. And I think I'm going to actually stop here for the part one here very briefly, very shortly, so I can go the next time deeper into this, what makes DHA actually special over EPA. But essentially, it's called um, special uh, resolve proteins. Those are cytokines that EPA does not make. SPAs are different from EPA, and there's a whole class of four of them that actually create a whole different array of immune suppression. So in DHA deficient states, um, you can definitely measure IL-6 and TNF alpha in the brain, and that in turn disrupts your blood-brain barrier just as it creates leaky gut in your digestive tract. And that again can be measured in terms of BDNF, and then again leads to a lack of the specific LPC DHA not being incorporated into the brain. That in turn then leads to shrinkage of brain, shrinkage of neural tissue, basically means loss of function, loss of synaptic function, loss of making connections. And we know we can kind of correlate that to our RBC omega-3, but we definitely need to be aware that a high level of omega-3 in your RBCs does not necessarily mean it makes it to the brain. So yeah, this is the blood-brain barrier. Just to finish this up today, the blood-brain barrier is not something that happens in your neck or something that happens in every cell. And it's basically a lining from the blood vessels to the neural cells. There's a whole host of them, but you can kind of see how the cells kind of attach to the blood vessels in this picture here. And they need to have a constant flow of glucose or keto bodies when you're starving in order to make at least beta oxidation happen so you can make ATP. So they're very connected directly to the blood cells. And obviously that barrier then um, is happening everywhere in the brain, in every blood cell and every connection to cells. And that is what is the leakage I'm talking about in your blood-brain barrier. And you have a tight junction loss and functionality loss. And that is, directly connected to omega-3. Um, so the fluidity of the membrane is directly connected to higher omega-3. The thickness of the membrane and its phase transition. I talk a lot about how omega-3 actually makes the blood and the membrane more fluid. Yeah, I think I'm gonna stop here today and then go into more details the next time. And this will be even more interesting in terms of science later. But let me see if I have a final slide here that I didn't incorporate properly, but I can definitely uh, get to the final slide here. And that is, my last slide here. So you can steer towards better brain function, better functionality of these proteins that transport and create the blood-brain barrier because you can steer towards better LPC, DHA, better incorporation into the brain. And I was talking a lot lately about how we absorb omega-3 much better with our AquaX. And that's basically the summary for today. Yeah, I'm gonna stop here and stop the recording. And if there's any questions, I will definitely answer them.